I am Sonny Mumbunan, a researcher at the University of Indonesia and at the World Resources Institute, WRI Indonesia. I'm chairing this keynote speech. I'm excited to introduce Ms. Miriam Laker-Oketta. She's a medical doctor with advanced training in tropical medicine, international health, and research methods, which include epidemiology and biostatistics. She's the research director at GiveDirectly. As you probably know, it is the leading global NGO specialized in delivering digital cash transfers. GiveDirectly has presence or have been engaged in 11 countries, including in Uganda. It has undertaken a series of experimental evaluations, what we know as, randomized control trials, RCTs, with independent researchers. It tries to document the impacts on recipients of cash transfers, as well as on the local economy. Before joining GiveDirectly, she was a senior researcher at the United States East Africa HIV-associated malignancies research group. It is a collaboration group with the Makerere University in Uganda and the University of California, San Francisco in the US. She has a deep exposure to poverty issues, of course, in addition to direct engagement with the poor as part of her profession. She, among others, headed the Client Welfare and Development Board Committee of Uganda-based Community Health Initiative, which serves the urban poor in Uganda. In today's keynote speech, she will address the role of basic income for tackling climate change and biodiversity issues, linking this to poverty and economic opportunities, while at the same time critically discussing the role of basic income. So, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome to the stage Ms. Miriam Laker-Oketta.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. In Uganda, when we say good afternoon, everyone responds good afternoon. So my basic training up to my medical degree, I got in Uganda. Then I went to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so we sat in a room like this, and the person got up and said, "Good morning." And I answered, "Good morning," and everyone looked at me like, so yeah, so I'm born, bred in Uganda, trained in Uganda, the London School of Hygiene. Then I trained in the University of California, San Francisco as well, where I'm still on the faculty, Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. 2 years ago, I made a very interesting decision. I think it was midlife crisis, turned 40. I was like, what next? I've done enough medicine. I want to do something different. And then I come across something called cash transfers. I was like, wait a minute, this is interesting. Cash doesn't work. People are going to take alcohol. They're going to take drugs. So I started reading the research around cash transfers. And then I discovered an organization called GiveDirectly that is looking for a research director. And I applied for the job. And then one of the first things I told my CEO, who is my direct supervisor, I told him, I'm a doctor. I know a lot of research, but I'm a doctor, but I want to do this thing. And so the rest is history, and I'm part of GiveDirectly now as the research director. It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about universal basic income because throughout my medical career as well, I worked with people living in absolute poverty. My first placement as an intern doctor was in northern Uganda, and at that time there was a lot of insurgency. There was a war that had been going on for over 20 years. And for me, that was my first, really second real interaction with poverty, and I'll explain to you this. I grew up in a neighborhood, which I didn't know at the time was a very wealthy neighborhood. But because that is the only place I had lived, I thought everyone lived like that. And I thought we were really poor. Our neighbors we had the American embassy 2 doors away from us. We had the German embassy right next door to our house, like literally right next door to our house. We had people who were CEOs at Shell, Shell, the fuel company, right next door. And because they were all really wealthy, my father used to work with Pepsi Cola. Because these were really wealthy people, I thought we were poor. And like forever, I thought we were poor. Until I get to the university, And then we're working in a national hospital, and people cannot afford to buy the most basic medicine. I was like, wait a minute, is this real? And that was my first real exposure to poverty. And since then, all the work I've done in my career has been very linked to poverty because it made me understand my privilege. Many times we live in a bubble of privilege. Many of us are born and grow up in privilege, and we don't know what is happening right next door. And because of that, even when I travel, I see the people on the streets. I was surprised. This is my first time in Germany, by the way. And I was telling my husband yesterday, I was like, I had pizza for dinner. It was too much. I gave some to a homeless person. He's like, the homeless people in Germany? I was like, yeah, they are. So now intuitively, I look out and I notice that there are people who don't have the privilege that we have. But I digress, which is my nature. Let's go on to the presentation. I hope this works. I'll just go manual. So when I was asked to give a presentation on this topic, first I was like, UBI, GiveDirectly, by the way, is doing the largest UBI experimental study ever done in the world. It's in Kenya. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And so I thought, this is going to be presenting the usual UBI. And then I read the topic properly, like, okay, climate change, biodiversity loss. I was like, easy. As the usual researcher, what do? Google Scholar. PubMed, I'm like, wait a minute. What I discovered was, in spite of cash being the most researched development intervention, less than 1% of those studies looks at the impact of cash transfers on the environment. Like, surprise, right? Everyone is talking about climate change. We're doing these great research projects, and we are literally not looking at the impacts of this great intervention on the environment. And I was like, okay, that is a bad thing for me, but it's also a good thing. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, we are going to just go back to basics, definitions. First of all, what is basic income? Surprisingly, this is an Institute of Basic Income Studies, and you know this better than me. There are many definitions of basic income. This is just two. There is lots more. One of them, have a farm income floor. No one should go have an income below that floor. It should be given without any behavioral conditionality. You don't have to agree to do or not do something to receive it. There should be no means test. Whether you are the president or you're the person living on the street, you should get this income. There should be no procedures that are perceived as intrusive or stigmatizing. That last bit is really interesting. I was talking, we had a conference on dignity a few weeks ago. And I was talking to one of the dignity experts from the US, and she showed me a very interesting graph. Do you know that the most hated people in the US are people on benefits? Did you know that? And yet, when you look at the hate score for people who are poor are not hated at all. But when you're on benefits, then you're hated. And so that is why the UBI definition says there should be nothing that would make it stigmatizing. That is Oxford research. What about the Basic Income Earth Network? It says it's a universal, unconditional, individual, regular cash payment. But what about the threshold for basic? What is the threshold for basic? A lot of people begin thinking PPP, right? But these are the multiple schools of thought. The first one is that it must enable people in poverty to meet their basic needs. Another group is like, wait a minute. It has to provide a reliable economic foundation upon which other income sources can be freely added. Another is like, wait, what? Our threshold for basic is different. It should be a set level that provides the basis for a modest but decent lifestyle. And then another group says the right level varies. It may fall below the basic needs level, but also it may be above the basic needs level. So far we are on the same page, right? Basic income. What about biodiversity? When I was working on this, my 11-year-old son said, Mama, what is biodiversity? I was like, it's a complex word for all the living things on the planet, which is true. So these explanations of biodiversity is from the UN. The first thing it says that thanks to the pressures of human beings, millions of species are going to be extinct in the next few years. And the major drivers for that, deforestation, overfishing, bushmeat hunting and poaching, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species. A bug that is living very well in Germany, you move it to Uganda, it would be a troublesome bug. Some of you, anyone been to Uganda here? Great, have you seen the Nile perch? That huge fish, right? There's that huge, the Nile perch is a really huge fish. Its natural habitat is the River Nile. That's why it's called the Nile perch. Some years ago, some scientists were like, what would happen if we put the Nile perch in Lake Victoria, which is the lake that is the source of the Nile? The Nile perch in its natural habitat grows about this big, like literally this big. But when you move it to the Lake Victoria, it grows like much bigger than I am. And what does it do when it gets there? It begins to eat the fish that exists in there. So that is a problem, right? And interestingly, 7 out of the 17 UN sustainability goals directly address biodiversity loss, and many others indirectly address biodiversity loss. And then what about climate change? We all know of climate change, shifts in temperature and weather patterns. It is natural. Those who are born in the days that I was born, you watched Ice Age, I believe. Climate change happens, it happens naturally. But since the 1800s, the human beings have been accelerating climate change, mainly because of burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. So we all have the basics, right? Next is going to be something interesting, not usually done in keynote presentations. Remember I said how much evidence is there? Cash and the environment? Less than 1% of 1,000, which is like literally zero, right? So we're going to have a quick debate. I'm going to forcefully tell you where you're going to belong. We're going to have proposers on this side and opposers on this side. You have no choice. You know, nature has placed you where you are. So this is what is going to happen. The great thing is when you don't have evidence, when we don't have evidence, then we are free to use our brains, right? Most of the time that people get up to speak in an academic forum, they tell you, what does the literature say? Is there any evidence? But now we have shown that there's literally zero evidence, right? And so we are free to use our brains, and we're going to have maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and we're going to have, where are the proposers again? Proposers and opposers. And this is the question, does basic income have a role in addressing climate change and biodiversity loss? I want you guys to protect it with your lives, and I want you guys to tear them down, okay? The great thing about such debates is that it usually forms hypotheses for future research. I'm a lecturer, so I know this. When people use their brains, then they come up with real hypotheses for future research. So our time starts now. Can we have the proposers take the floor? This is the question. It doesn't have to be in the literature. What do you think? If the proposers are not ready, we can have someone from the opposer side. Yes?
So the basic income allows for more local forms of production, which are inherently more ecological than current global supply chains. Very ecologically disastrous.
Okay, great. I'm not giving my opinion, by the way. The judges are listening. Any other proposer or opposer? Just think, we are free to use our brains. Doesn't have to be on the internet, doesn't have to be in the literature anywhere. Yes?
Climate change and biodiversity loss need knowledge, not money.
Interesting. Knowledge, not money. Yes?
While abolishing poverty, basic income will need people to spend more money, to take more resources and destroy more of environmental resources.
Okay, you have more money, spending a lot. Yes?
With a better income, people would also have more time to invest in other types of activities that would also involve maybe restoration or conservation of local ecosystems. So in a way, this would increase the biodiversity.
Okay, people have more time to focus on things, including the environment. Yes? Disagree.
No, one limit spending more money could also lead to more climate destruction.
Okay. More money, buying lots of clothes, landfills, yes?
When your basic needs are met, then you have the mental space and capacity to inform yourself and be more open to acting on or engaging on topics like climate change and biodiversity.
Oh, okay, fine. Uh-huh.
I think all this is utopian thinking.
I love it, just utopian thinking. Strong opposition, yes, at the back. Yeah. Oh, you want to move? Yes, sir.
If you get basic income, you don't need to work things you would never do when you have the basic income.
So you have money and don't
so
have to work. Yeah.
You have the time and the possibility to focus on totally different things, not on surviving.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
If it's financed by a carbon tax or by environmental taxations, then you can calculate if you are net recipient. This means saving in average term the environment, or if you are net payer, then paying more due to your carbon reduction.
Okay, great. Thank you. Opposers have given up, right? Yes. Anyone knows about peat? So peat is like the most important thing for climate change. It is the thing that has allowed us to continue surviving in spite of the high carbon emissions we have in the world. So peat is found in natural forests. Because natural forests are so dense, right? The process of decomposition doesn't happen like in the open. So decomposition takes years. If you threw a leaf in the middle of the Amazon or in the Congo Forest, it won't decompose as fast as it would out there in the compound. Because the environment is so different within the dense forest, the breakdown is extremely slow, and it forms this kind of mud that is called peat. And peat has the ability to absorb like tons of carbon dioxide, tons of it literally. And recently, about maybe 10 years ago, it was discovered that the forest in the Democratic Republic of Congo has the largest peat concentration in the world. And so that forest is what has made us survive probably up to now. And then guess what happens in July this year? The government of Congo decides to auction oil blocks in that very same forest where there is peat. And if peat is taken away, you know what would happen? Two things. One, we have lost the biggest absorber of carbon dioxide that is produced. But two, it will release all the carbon dioxide it has been storing for all these years. And so the world goes up in arms. Congo, you cannot do this. It is not permissible. It is not allowed. And the minister of Congo says, why should we stay poor so you can breathe? She's asking people in the developed world, why should we stay poor so that you guys can breathe? And we're going to get into this a bit more. 3 facts about poverty and the environment. One, most of the pollution is caused by the wealthy nations. Not surprising, right? On the right, World Bank carbon dioxide emissions, top 20 countries emitting carbon dioxide. When you look at that, you see literally only one country from Africa, and that is it even there? Yes, 13, South Africa. But when you look at the per capita polluters, countries like South Africa and India disappear. You know what is happening there over there? Because now you're putting into consideration even the poor people, the amount of carbon dioxide that is produced by a country when divided across everyone becomes small. So that the poorer the country, the smaller the carbon emission. And you can look at the bottom. So in India, it comes down to just 1.2 per person. In countries like Kenya, it's about 0.3. So most of the production of carbon dioxide that we're worried about is happening in the developed world. And what happens is that preserving the environment takes away economic opportunities. Remember earlier on, we said one of the things that are destroying the environment are things like hunting bushmeat, cutting down trees, polluting the water, overfishing, right? And people who live in these areas that have been earmarked for conservation are completely inundated with don'ts. Don't fish, don't hunt bushmeat, don't cut trees, don't pollute, don't. And this is an excerpt from the New York Times. Just remember the story of Peat that I just talked about? And look at what I highlighted there. It says, what has partly kept Peat locked up is the absence of roads or infrastructure. The absence, in other words, of economic opportunities for the people who live there. So when we're saying don't to the people who live in the places we want to preserve, don't cut the trees, don't fish, don't do this, we are depriving them of economic opportunities. We are telling them to not do the very things that the developed world did to become high-income countries. You see how crazy that is, right? Extremely crazy. This next set of photographs, I don't know why this is not showing, it's a really beautiful photograph, but it's not, do you see anything? I don't see anything. Thank you. So this is an aerial view of part of that huge forest in the DRC, okay? Amazing. So this is from the New York Times. I didn't take these photographs, but I thought they're amazing. And please read the article in the New York Times. It's really amazing. So it says, beneath these trees, along this river, which runs right through the Congo Forest, down the road, look at the people sitting in that car, right? They don't look like people in freebies, right? Okay, lies one of the planet's greatest natural resources, as long as it is kept undisturbed. Remember, don't, right? And that is peat. And I've told you what I know about peat. So that is what peat looks like. It's like black mud. It's all like sludge, actually. So that is what it is. So I just wanted you to take the vastness of the beauty of that environment, but look at the people who are living in it. Did you see their quality of life? Just by looking at the people sitting in that vehicle, none of us would want to be living there, okay? But what they're sitting on is literally what is saving the world. We move on to fact 3 about poverty and the environment. Climate disasters disproportionately affect people in poverty. And this is just a snapshot from across the world. Starting with the US, heat waves hit the low-income communities hardest because they live in concrete areas. They don't, there are barely any green areas around them. They cannot afford to regulate temperatures in their houses, so they're disproportionately affected by heat, but also by the extreme cold and by floods. In the middle, that is a photograph from Uganda taken this year. Drought in the northern part of Uganda affecting many people living in poverty. And the last one is a few weeks ago, probably, Mozambique, that hurricane affected many people living in poverty. And this graph just shows the number of poor people at the 3 different poverty lines that are exposed to catastrophic floods. And you can see Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are taking the trophy, right? Most of the people who are suffering the effects or the impacts of climate change are people living in poverty, and mainly in Asia and in Africa. And a gentleman called Osborne said, it is important for all of us to realize that we're all in the same storm. This climate change affects all of us, but we are not all on the same boat. Some people are in luxury cruise ships, others are in canoes. And the people in canoes are the people living in poverty. So why do we even mention basic income in this discussion of climate change and biodiversity loss? The evidence has shown us that it is not important because people are not looking at the impact of basic income on the environment. So why are we bringing this up? Once again, out of DRC, what do the protectors of the Congo peatlands get in return? What do they get in return for conserving the environment? What does the fisherman living in South America get by not overfishing? What do people living in the Amazon, the Congo, get from not cutting down trees? What do they benefit from that? This was from July 2022, interesting, my birthday, 24th July, New York Times again. So that is when the news became a news flash. Guys, guess what? Congo is going to auction the forest that is saving us to oil companies. People were bewildered. How can they even do this? And the catch is that Congo is going to make a lot of money from that deal. Over $500 million in the next 5 years. And the minister says we have a lot more. We have a huge capacity to produce so much oil. Russia has disorganized the world, we can't get oil, but come to Congo, we have the oil. When they reach out to people like Total decided not to comment. I have a feeling that in the background, something may be happening. And so the minister of, the head representative on the Climate Council for Congo said, the only reason Congo is auctioning this land is because we need revenue. We need revenue to develop our country. We need revenue to help the people living in poverty in our country, in those very forests that you're telling us not to destroy. And then the Minister of Environment says, should we protect the peatlands because it is a carbon sink, or should we dig oil for our economy? Very important questions. When you are a leader in a place where people are not eating, but you're not going to feed them because you have to save the world, it's quite obvious what decision you're going to make, right? And so the question is basic income going to be the answer to climate change and biodiversity loss, or will it at least be part of the answer? I will start off with the arguments against basic income. I'll start off by supporting the opposing team, okay? The first one is that basic income will increase consumption and accelerate climate change and biodiversity loss. So please do not give people in poverty enough to meet their basic needs, because it's going to worsen the situation in which we are living right now. Very strong argument. You find it all over the internet, right? But I think there's a solution to that. If you are eating pizza and you have 8 out of 10 slices and someone comes and gets 1, are you going to blame them for finishing the pizza? What about redistributing the pizza? What about you eat fewer slices and let the newcomers have a little more? Isn't that something we can do with consumption as well? How much do we really need to use our private cars rather than take public transportation, rather than ride the bicycle, rather than walk? How much stuff in our houses do we really need? How much food do we actually need? Those of us who are able to afford, why don't we reduce our consumption and let other people who are living in poverty get a basic income so they're able to eat a little bit of this pizza? Other arguments say UBI alone is not enough, so we shouldn't even bother with it. We shouldn't bother with it, right? This is a result of an experimental study that was done in Finland. They're like, what would the impact of UBI on the carbon dioxide emissions be in Finland? And what they found was that at the time that the study was started, the carbon emissions from Finland was 9.4. And with UBI, it was estimated to be about half of the 9.4. But because the ideal level is 2 to 3, the result, people say, you know what, it doesn't work. UBI just brought it only to 4.8, and yet it should be as low as 2, so I think we should stop all this, right? But what is the solution to this? A multifaceted approach. If someone has been going to their doctor and their problem is I smoke 20 cigarettes every day, and then miraculously they try something new and they get down to 10, is the best solution for their doctor to say, no, you just at 10, so abandon whatever it is that has been working for you and let's look for another solution? Or is it to say, let's go on with what has been working and let's find out, is there something else that can reduce your count from 10 to 0? And I believe that is the approach. That is what we should be thinking about to counter this argument. Remember this one? There's not enough evidence. Why do we want to make such big decisions in the absence of evidence? And my answer is, we need to start with what we have. The problem with evidence, the way we have misconstrued research, is to a place where we say the evidence that we have right now is the entirety of the truth. So if there's no evidence that exists, then it means that there's no evidence at all. But research is something that is dynamic. It is a constant search of the truth. What you know today may change the next research project that is done. So in the same way with the arguments for UBI, can we begin to do more research looking at the impacts of cash on the environment? I was telling my colleagues at work this morning and saying, you know, when I come back I'm based in Kampala, by the way. I said, when I come back, we're going to change our policy at GiveDirectly. Every research project we do, every general program we do must have an environment-related indicator. Because I was equally shocked to find that there's so little evidence on the impact of cash on the environment, in spite of cash being the most research development intervention in the world to date. So can we make these changes at policy level in our institutions as well? Let's begin to actively look for the evidence. Moving on to the proposal side, in my opinion, there are two main things. There could be many more, but I think there are two main things. We need to look at the impact of UBI in terms of its ability to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Climate change has happened. You know, I always tell my kids when they're fretting over things, I'm like, two things. Is it in your circle of control or is it in your area of concern? Can you control it? If you can, do what you can. If you cannot control it, just shut up, right? And so climate change has already happened. A lot has happened that we probably may not be able to change, or if we can change, it will take a long time to change. So when we are thinking of UBI, we need to think about it also in terms of, can we mitigate the impacts of climate change on people living in poverty using UBI? The second thing is, fine, a lot has gone bad to date. Can we prevent it from going forward? The Western world, many years ago, when your ancestors cut down trees and destroyed the peatlands here, it's because they did not know this information. And I always tell people, you cannot blame the Western world for where they are as a result of destroying the environment, because at the time, we didn't have the evidence that what was happening had repercussions on the world. So that has already happened. But now that we know, do we want to continue doing the wrong thing? Do we want to destroy the peatlands in DRC because for my reading, Germany used to have a lot of forests, am I wrong? Because in Germany, many years ago, people destroyed the peatlands as well. Are we going to continue doing wrong because somebody else did wrong, even when we know now that it is wrong and they did not know then that it was wrong? And so we need to look at how can UBI prevent the worsening of our climate? Can it preserve our environment and restore the environment? So I'll just quickly go through both of them. So looking at UBI for climate change, for mitigation of the impacts of climate change. This is a very recent photograph from this year taken in Uganda. This place is a mountain called Mount Elgon. Ugandan visitor, you know Mount Elgon? Yeah. Mount Elgon, one of the biggest, tallest mountains in Uganda, formerly volcanic mountain. The richest soil you can find in Uganda is in Elgon. I mean, people have farms as small as this room and the yield is amazing. And so because of that, there is so much population pressure on the mountains. You can see there is practically no tree on the slopes of these mountains. But remember, volcanic soil is loose, right? And so all the trees have been cut, people are farming, people are living on there. And when it rains, and Uganda can have heavy rainfall like this time of the year, the landslides, I mean, literally almost every other day there is a landslide. And so recently GiveDirectly decided that we're going to give cash to people living on these mountains to hopefully get them to relocate. And so we did a scoping trip to the region. And one of the old men we spoke to, so this old man's house was next to a crack. The land had already cracked. And in his house, he said, in the night when it's silent, you can hear the water rushing through, right? And so we're like, why don't you move? And he said, you know, you think I want to be here? I would have moved if I had the money to move. And so what am I trying to say? When we give people cash, when we have a UBI, people have agency to make decisions around how they are going to respond to climate disasters. Am I going to reinforce my house? Am I going to relocate? What am I going to do? People then get options to make some of these decisions. Am I going to plant trees instead to protect the soil on which my house is sitting? UBI will also increase the capacity for community resilience. Some of the things that we've seen money do is unbelievable. We give cash to individual households, by the way. We don't give it to cooperative groups of community or communities. But because people know that everyone in their community has received cash, they come together to do things for their community. For instance, for climate change, people would decide as a community to put up flood barriers, community level, right? It also gives people a safety net. When you know that in the event of a climate disaster, I have money in an account to make the decisions I need to make now. I have money to temporarily move my family from point A to point B. The amount of agency it gives. Because otherwise, without that agency, people live in places like that. Your neighbor died yesterday, but you're staying and praying and hoping to God it won't happen to you. Not because you don't want to move, but because you do not have the means to move. And what is the means to move? It is not a car, it is money to be able to make those decisions. My kids, you know, this generation is interesting. They ask, why are we going to school, right? We have what we need. And I tell them, money will give you options. Go to school, get money, it will give you options. You can decide to stay at home and do nothing, and you can decide to work, but if you have money, you have options. Same thing with UBI. What about UBI for environmental preservation and restoration? We've talked about increased consumption, but the interesting thing is that the consumption will increase in a positive direction. People will be able to afford more organic stuff, renewable, sustainable stuff. In Uganda, there are shoes, you know Crocs, right? But Crocs are quite expensive. Now in Uganda, we have a lot of Crocs from China, Crocs in quote. They look like Crocs, but they are not Crocs. They are also made of plastic. And because the quality is so poor, you get a pair that would last you maybe a month, and then you throw it away and get another pair. Because it's not because people don't want to buy the more expensive Crocs, but it's because what they can afford is what is the cheap one. And so when people have more income, they're more likely to spend on better quality products, which even if they're not biodegradable, have a longer lifetime. They will keep the same thing for a longer time. People will move from using the dangerous forms of energy to renewable sources of energy. This graph pie chart on the other side shows what people in Malawi use for heating. And you can see almost 90% of the population burns trees for heating and cooking. But when you give cash to people, they are more likely to afford alternative sources of energy for lighting and for heating and for cooking. Also, thinking in places outside Africa especially, when people have a universal basic income, they have a basic income, you know that your rent is covered, you know that food is covered, you know that basic health is covered. What is going to make you travel from place to place holding 4 jobs at the same time? And so indirectly, giving people that basic income has a reduction impact on the carbon footprint that results from traveling all over the place. Also, UBI equals more green and again less carbon dioxide emission. These are results from some of the RCTs that we have done with GiveDirectly. In this photograph here is one of the recipients in the Universal Basic Income RCT that is going on in Kenya, and you can see what he said. But by the way, the cash we give is completely unconditional. What is this saying? Even people in poverty know that the environment is important once their basic needs have been met, like someone over there mentioned. This man is using some of his money to simply plant trees. He said, I want to have up to 1,000 trees, eucalyptus trees in the next 12 years. And when we asked him why, he said, that's a legacy I want to leave for my children. So now he's thinking, and one of his children, the son, the taller one in the white shirt, is epileptic. And before he received these cash transfers, their lives rotated around this young man and his hospital bills. But now they have sufficient money to be able to invest in the environment while managing the health of their child. We did a randomized controlled trial in a coffee growing community in Uganda as well. And we found that the households that received cash transfers were more likely to increase their coffee acreage. So they were planting more coffee trees in their compounds and therefore increasing the green in the environment. Another study, not a GiveDirectly RCT, in Uganda as well, it called itself Payments for Ecosystem Services. So in this study, people were given unconditional cash, okay? People who had like trees in their compounds were given unconditional cash. And what was found at the end of the study is that people who received cash were less likely to cut down their trees. And an additional benefit that happened was that people had an increment an improvement in their economic well-being. And this improvement was higher among people who were poor compared to people who were rich at baseline. Also, another thing that basic income can do is increasing agriculture. So someone buys a cow, right? Or a bull. And so they're able to plow their land. So those who are not very familiar with countries like in Africa, people till their land using a hoe. There's you know what it is? It's like this one instrument and you have to keep digging with your hand. But when people get their basic income, they're able to afford a cow and then they make it plow. And so someone who was able to only have a land this big is now able to cover a larger area of land, okay? So they're able to plant more crop because they can afford better seed and they can afford organic fertilizers. They are more likely to use those. And so there's a bigger yield of organic, sustainable food and generally an incentive to continue farming, going green. And also because there's a higher production of food, there's a less reason for people to travel to other places looking for food and less reason to depend on food that is transported to their environment or to their local communities, thereby reducing the carbon emission from those methods of transportation. UBI has been found to improve happiness, subjective well-being. People who receive cash say, I'm happier, and life is good, I'm happier because I have money. Or they're able to afford healthcare and therefore have a better quality of life. And when people's quality of life is improved, they're more likely to think outside food, less likely to think only of rent, right? Familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? This is an amazing triangle, it works everywhere, pyramid. So the first level, so in case you're not familiar, so with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, his theory is that human beings will only move to the next level of the triangle when the needs of the previous triangles have been met. So the lowest level is basic needs. People want food, they want shelter, they want warmth, just the most basic things. And when they have that in place, then they begin to think of security and safety. And so when people's basic needs are met, they begin to think about the environment. What can I do to protect the environment? Oh my God, peat is going to mean, destroying peat means the earth may get destroyed because of a lot of carbon dioxide. When my tummy is full, I can think of things like that. In Uganda, when I was a little girl, there was a war which started suddenly. The president was overthrown. On a Saturday morning, we were lounging in the sunshine and we began to see helicopters and there was a war, like literally like that. And so it was a Saturday, my parents used to go shopping for the family on Saturdays, but they would first window shop and then shop at the end of the day. So the war starts in the morning, so they hadn't shopped for the week, and so they had to come home. 5 days into the war, we were like literally starving. There was no food in the house. And my parents left home in the middle of a war to go and look for food. I was mad at them. I was a little girl at the time, 8 years old. It was 2 days after my birthday, actually. I was 8 years old. But then when I grew up, I realized these people were not acting on their own. Nature was forcing them. Our kids don't have food. We are willing to dodge the bullets and get food for home. So it is as human nature, right? Care for people's basic needs, then they're going to care about your environment. Make sure the people living in the DRC forest, people living in the Amazon, have their basic needs met, then you can begin telling them about carbon dioxide emissions and protection and absorption. So UBI is able to do that. This is an example. The great thing about UBI, I remember unconditionality, right? So this is from some of our work in Rwanda. So in one of the areas in Rwanda, we gave people cash, unconditional cash transfers. Now in Rwanda is in East Africa, by the way, for those who are not familiar. Rwanda's government has its own development goals, and they require the mayors every year to report on every quarter to report on their progress on their development goals. Now the mayors in the areas where GiveDirectly worked were surprised to find that when they went back to their communities, their development goals were magically being met without people being told what to do. So you can see the before and after. And the ones I've highlighted are really directly linked to the environment, right? Or environmental protection and the like. So there were more cows per household. People will say, what are you talking about, cows and environmental protection? But remember, in Africa, we don't have we don't have that many number of cows, first of all. And also the benefits that will come from the cows, people will be able to have food from the cows, they'll be able to plow their land and therefore grow more on their land. They'll be able to get biogas and therefore use a more sustainable source of fuel, not as bad as cutting down trees, not too good though either. But then you look at all that, homelessness is reduced, so people have, there's more resilience. People are building pit latrines, averting pollution of water. People have beds with buying mattresses, right? And so quality of life is going up. Age of Heza is savings. People are able to save money, and so resilience, safety net, health insurance, improved subjective well-being, improved health. Homes are powered with electricity. All these as a result of unconditional cash transfers. Also, not everyone wants a goat. Not everyone who's going to receive money is going to buy a goat or a cow. So this is one of our recipients in Kenya. He said, well, I don't want a goat, I don't want to build a house. Everyone in my neighborhood is doing that. And he bought music instruments and started a band. And so in his community where people have received their UBI and are all happy, there are more parties happening. People are going to clubs more. And he's playing for all those functions and therefore making more money for himself and getting to a place of sustainability. So then the question is, where do we go from here? I'm about to finish. Where do we go from here? So this is the landscape of climate finance, 2019 to 2020. You can see it was up to $632 billion. And what you can see here is that most of it goes into mitigation of the impacts of climate. And what does that mean for us? Can we make this happen? Right now, the proportion of aid that is aid spending that is delivered as cash transfers is as low as that. 18% of humanitarian humanitarian aid is delivered as cash transfers, and within that, things like response to climate disaster emergencies is covered. But then look at how much cash is going for other development assistance. And our argument is, if we can move the amount of development aid that is being given as cash to about 60 or 70%, then we can achieve a UBI for everyone in the world, right? And then also when we're able to achieve a UBI for everyone, then its repercussions, which are positive on climate, is more likely to happen. So can we think about diverting a lot of that aid into development? Donut economics, I just love the donut economics, right? Which is another name for it, the sustainable economic development. The question that this donut economics asks is, can we simultaneously prioritize every single human being today, while at the same time prioritizing every single human being's future? Is that possible? And for those who are not very familiar with this, so the theory was developed by a lady whose name I've forgotten. She says we need to make sure that all these needs for every human being on the earth are met today and moved up to the level of rate. When everyone is at this rate circle, then everyone's today is okay. But then we should make sure that we do not crash outside this boundary. There's a limit of the things we can do. How are we changing consumption? How are we changing, everything? We need to make sure we don't go outside this green level, which is called the environmental ceiling, if we are going to preserve the environment. In other words, prioritize everyone's today to prioritize everyone's future simultaneously. How has it been playing out? Familiar with George Orwell's Animal Farm? All animals are equal, but other animals are more equal than others. This is an excerpt from the New York Times when they were talking about the government of Congo deciding to auction off their peat lands to oil companies. This is what it says: the environmental groups were outraged. Last week, Congo's officials doubled down, expanding the number of blocks. Long story, right? But guess what? Same time that was happening, that the world was outraged, guess what was happening? See that? Norway, that always is a leading advocate for saving forests, was increasing its oil production plans. See that, right? Guess what Joe Biden was doing? Flying to Saudi Arabia to increase the oil production, right? At the very same time when the whole world is outraged that the DRC is selling part of its oil or of its oil blocks to the world. Are all animals equal, or are some others more equal than others? And that is what the donut economics is trying to tell us. At a fundamental level, sustainable economic development means we design our economic policies to look after the planet and every single person in it, whether you're from Africa, whether you're from Europe, whether you're from Australia, every individual below and above poverty line must be catered for today and in the future. Coming back to cash and the donut economics. So in this model, the donut economics that we saw, an economy is considered prosperous when all the 12 social foundations, those things that were in the center, are met without overshooting the economic, the 9 ecological ceilings. Why is UBI a good answer to this? It's because cash is fungible. I'm a poor artist, these are my pictures, by the way. Cash is fungible. You give the same amount of money to 2 different people, they spend it on completely different things. And so with the donut economics, when each person receives their cash, they will prioritize the areas where they are in need. You don't have to say, okay, you need help, everyone in this house, help for everyone. I may not need help. My priority may be something completely different. But when you give people cash, you give them agency to make the decision for themselves. Who knows what this formula is about? Familiar? $2.15?
World Bank.
World Bank, excellent. So just recently, last month actually, the World Bank moved the poverty line from $1.95 from $1.90 to $2.15. So everyone below $2.15 is living in extreme poverty. How much money does it take to put everyone at least to the poverty line in 1 year? It is only $785 per person. When we tell people that you can give these people this as a lump sum, everyone is like, oh, how do you give someone in poverty about $1,000? And yet, if I say give them $215 per day for a year, they'll be like, oh yeah, please go ahead. What's happening right there? The question I'm trying to ask is, what is the best way for us to do a UBI? What's the best way to do a UBI? One of the things GiveDirectly does is lump sum. We guys are crazy, right? We give it lump sum. And everyone thinks we're nuts. Why do we think lump sum is good? Because we have found out from the research that we have done that when you give someone the same amount of money over multiple distributions, we call it flow, they are going to spend it on the everyday needs, right? I'm going to buy food, I'm going to pay my rent, I'm going to buy clothes. But when you give the same amount of money as a lump sum, people are going to meet their immediate basic needs and they're going to have excess. And what do most people do with the excess? They invest it into things that are productive. And therefore, because they've invested into things that are productive, you're able to increase the tax base of a country. They're able to provide jobs for other people who are therefore able to pay more tax. And we know that there's a group of people, even with the lump sum, who will not get out of poverty. But because we've increased the tax base, more people are paying tax, governments will be able to have a source of income to maintain those who are not able to graduate from poverty. Sounds very simple, right? Right? Anyway, so I think we need to think large scale. If we are going to save ourselves, we are going to save the peatlands, we are going to save the oceans, we need to think large scale. Can we meet the universal basic income need for everyone at the same time? Finally, what is left to do, right? If we think it's very easy, give a lump sum, and for those who cannot graduate, give them flow. What is left to do? We started off by saying there is practically zero evidence on the impact of cash transfers on the environment. We need to properly evaluate UBI and its impacts on the environment. Some of you may be familiar with Jeffrey Sachs, right? Jeffrey Sachs had this great idea, ending world poverty, millennium villages, and now you almost never hear about him. The biggest criticism Jeffrey Sachs had was that his programs were not evaluated. So when I come to an institution like this with brilliant academics, let's think about how are we going to evaluate a large-scale UBI, its impact on the environment. How are we going to deliver it? Will it be cash only? Will it be cash plus some other interventions? Cash plus education? What will it be? Brains like this should be the brains that are thinking about these answers. Are we going to target? Are we going to give the cash only to people living below the poverty line? Or are we going to saturate the entire world, giving everyone a UBI? This excerpt again is from the DRC. When we target, we've also learned from my experience, if you go to a community and say, you receive cash, you don't, you receive, you don't. In many countries, people know what is happening in the neighbor's house. And so it can lead to a lot of conflict in those communities. So are we going to target? Is it going to be universal? Can we have the academics think about answers for that? What are the macroeconomic impacts of grand-scale UBI? What is going to happen to the economics? We've done a lot of studies looking at the impact of injecting like 20% of GDP into a community and found that it practically leads to zero inflation. But those are small communities, those are not countries. So can we have the bright brains in this room think about it, hypothesize? You know, when there's no evidence, it's great, right? You can come up with these hypotheses which then get tested. What about the impacts of diverting most of government aid into cash? What will happen to the governments that have to provide the complementary services? Are they going to accept it? Are they going to reject it? Is this sustainable? And finally, we are talking about in GiveDirectly now what we call the blue diamond theory. We are saying if we believe so much that UBI can be the answer to the environment, right? The opposers dried out after like 2 words, right? So we believe so much. Can we prove it to the world? Can we pick a country and do it so well in there that the rest of the world, that the light that comes out from this great work that we've done shines out to the rest of the world, including the 200 billion the dollars that is assigned every year to development. The great work that we've done shines so well there that the decision is made that we need to increase the amount of development aid amount of development aid into cash by a significant fraction, maybe 60-70%. And this is the last slide. That word is not time. In my language, I come from Uganda, northern Uganda, it says time. Time means it is possible. But is it funny that it spells time as well? It will take time, but it is possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Miriam, for being
Back to the chairperson.
thought-provoking. We see, I know you will be having, I see hands already.
There are many questions I'd like to ask you, but the one I will limit myself to is, you said when you go back, you're going to be saying to your team, we need to include environmental dimensions, environmental questions in all of our research, which I'm thrilled to hear. And I'm wondering whether you've done any thinking yet about what kinds of questions you're going to be asked. As I said yesterday, Sarath and I have a PhD student who is studying exactly this, looking at certain pilots in the south and in the north, including the one we work on in India, to track things like tonnage change, consumption change, maybe attitudinal change. And so I'm closely connected to this question, very interested in the extent to which you've thought about what particular kinds of research questions can be asked and how you might do so. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, okay, concerning Bernard Neumarker, Friedrich, concerning your idea with the lump sum transfer. Did I understand that quite right, that you mean by lump sum the payment for the whole year? This 365 times $2, blah, blah, blah. These round about $780. This reminds me, if yes, then I would say principally it's okay concerning a payment system, because you need transfers, and transfer for a year, say in advance, and you pay taxes usually after the year. Yeah? You need to transfer for production, for investment, and you pay the taxes when you have done your investments and you have your profits, your taxable income, and so on and so forth. So this would be a very nice thing, but on the other hand, it reminds me a little bit on the debate between Thomas Piketty and others on the basic capital. where he argues we pay basic capital to individuals in developed, so-called developed countries, where they are educated and then they receive round about 250,000 euro or the half, I do not remember what was the last payment, and then they have their basic capital for their whole life. Yeah? It's against periodically paid basic income. And my argument, the argument of others was, with your investment, you can become a loser. Yeah? With the failure in the investment. So this has an investment risk, and also during the year. And I would not like to see individuals who receive basic income and who really need it, that they could fail. So therefore, in that way, I would say the eligibility from month to month would be perhaps preferable to a lump sum for a year, yeah, because then you don't have the investment risk. But you say there is an additional investment option by the lump sum. How would you like to handle this trade-off of risk and options? Because with basic income we have a lot of options, but sometimes with a lump sum payment for a year, it might be that we forget the risk as well as with the basic capital. You know what I mean? That bankers arise and said, 250,000 euros, I know what to do with that money. Yeah? We will arrange some shares for Mercedes-Benz and others, and if the firms break down, sorry, that return of investment is gone now, and your basic capital is also gone. Now you have to stay on a welfare system once again. We should be protected against this. How would you like to do that?
I have a question, just to add to what Bernie has said. In GiveDirectly experimentation, do you have other models also of giving periodic every month, or it's only one model of giving lump sum?
So in GiveDirectly, we run a number of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, but we also have a lot of programs that are going on. And I don't want us to miss the opportunity of getting these questions also answered in our routine programs. So we'll have very basic questions. What did you do with your cash transfers? And we'll ask questions like, did you plant any trees? What are you using for cooking? So questions that are directly related to what the research so far has shown that is either accelerating or can slow down the rate of climate disaster. But of course, we would also want to look at things like attitude change, because behavior change takes time, you know? There's that song, it takes a little time to turn the Titanic around. If you've been doing something for a long time, you need a special intervention to make you change. So for our more rigorous studies like the RCTs, we are going to also include that. One of the policies that I added when I came to GiveDirectly research is do not do an RCT without the qualitative component. And the reason is very simple. When you do an RCT that is only quantitative, you get all these results that you have to start hypothesizing. I think we have this amount of change because, but when you do a qualitative, you have the answers from the people that you studied. The change is 0.3 and the community has told you why. And so we will also be including those. But this is going to be evolving, and we are planning for our next year, this quarter, and we are definitely going to include climate. You're welcome to get in touch in case we can collaborate going forward. Thank you. The other question is about the lump sum, but let me start by answering this question about the modality. So for what we call our flagship programs, which are our routine programs, we give lump sums, and we give $1,000 per household, like nominal, not even PPP, $1,000 per household. And we are really crazy in that now we are saying one of our values is accept reality, propose solutions. In Uganda, remember the landslides I showed you? We have gone to that community, and after scoping, we found out that land is very expensive in that place, and $1,000 is going to be a drop in the ocean for them. So what are we doing? We're giving $1,800 per household in that community. And everyone was like, oh, how do you do that? But the government got interested, and the government is going to add an extra about $2,000 for every household. So you start somewhere, right? There's no evidence that you give $1,800, people are going to relocate. But we're like, let's start. And now the government has come on board and is even giving more. So that's our flagship programs. We have programs, though, that we run in collaboration with partners. For instance, there may be a partner that is interested in nutrition, there may be a partner who is interested in pregnancy or is interested in coffee, whatever it is. And some of them may want to give the cash over time. And what we use to inform our decision on whether or not we'll work with you is what does the current evidence say. So for instance, for nutrition, right, if the outcome of interest is related to nutrition, we did an RCT, a benchmarking study with USAID in Rwanda, and we found that the only way you can remove the nutrition impacts, right, like children's weight for age, those usual things, is if you give every household at least $532. And so if you're coming with a nutrition program and you're giving less than that, we say no, and we explain to you why. So for things like nutrition, we can give it over time because evidence shows that when you give recurrent money, then nutrition outcomes are more likely to be achieved than if you gave a lump sum. So more people get positive nutrition outcomes. So we vary them based on the evidence, and if there's no evidence, we say what is reasonable, let's do it and generate the evidence for it. So that is the approach we use. Coming to your question, risks of giving a lump sum. And it's true, you know what happened? We had an RCT that we're doing in Rwanda as well. So a benchmarking study. So USAID is, over time, has become really interested in this basic income theory. And they're like, can we compare, can we benchmark the interventions we are giving for development against cash? And so in one of them that was in Rwanda, the intervention from USAID was youth training for skills and employability. So one group received just that training, one group received that training plus an equivalent amount of cash, and one group received an equivalent amount of cash. Before COVID, the cash group was like, wow, people invested and they were making money and life was really good. So that was our first endline, 1.8 years down the road, we're like, amazing, right? And then COVID happens. And because people had received the lump sum, they were more likely to take a risk, like you said, right? And so they had taken the risk, they had started businesses, and then COVID happened, and a lot of them lost those businesses. But the thing is that at the end of the day, right, their performance in terms of income and the like was still better than those people that did not receive cash. And you know what is funny? The group that received both interventions did worse than the groups that received only one intervention. Crazy, there's a lot to learn. So yes, there are going to be risks. And so that's why we ask the question, is it possible that we need to have what we call plus interventions? And so it's a really evolving field. And by plus interventions in this case, do people need financial literacy alongside the cash that they receive? We are doing an RCT for that in Liberia right now. Just before people receive, when you receive money, we become mad, you get excited, right? So just before people receive cash, can we have a discussion? How do you plan to spend this money? How can you budget it? And then we give people cash. So we're doing an RCT and we're going to learn from that. Can people make the right decisions when they're given some kind of input on how to spend their cash? There's just so much to learn in the cash field, but so far from our studies in the past and knowing that these events that increase the risk of loss are they're not the everyday thing. COVID came and it has gone. So it can happen, it is possible it could happen. Can we mitigate it? Probably we can, and we're trying to learn how can you mitigate it. But in the meantime, our main programs are lump sums because we've seen how it's able to graduate people out of poverty. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. I think the modalities could, we may find that the modalities vary by country or by even communities. So what we're saying is we don't know whether what we're doing is the best, and that's why research is a very important component of our organization because it's learning on the go. And so we really try as much as possible to get many more brains to work with us on things like this. What is the best way to do cash basic income in Germany? What is the best way to do it in Indonesia? What is the best way to do it in Uganda? Maybe even within the country, it's you do it in a different way for different groups of people. So it's all really learning that is going on. I think we've gotten to a point where, so if you look at the evidence around cash transfers, most of it is, does cash work? But I think we've gotten to a point where we know that it works. We need to be asking ourselves, what is the best way to do cash? I think that is where we should be at the moment.
In your, when you use this term, do you use unconditional cash transfer or do you use universal basic income?
We opened our operations in the US last year, and there we're using the term guaranteed income, right? So because when I say guaranteed, I say basic, people are going to understand it in very different ways. So as an organization, we mainly use the word unconditional cash transfers because the unconditional component and cash transfers captures what is within UBI. It has to be unconditional and it is cash. So yeah.
Yeah, in the BN's definition, one critical fifth element after universal, unconditional, individual, periodic. And periodic is the fifth element. So then by that definition, if you are not giving, only though that model where you give every month over a period of time, like in your case, I think you were also planning 12 years at stretch to give some people. So then we can use the term basic income. Otherwise, it's a cash transfer.
Very good point. And I always, I like challenging the norm, right? Who decided that it has to be periodic? Why can we not give, if you're going to give me $2.15 every day for a year, what's wrong with giving it to me today? You know, it's even cheaper because when you're doing multiple cash transfers, the cost of withdrawing is tax. So most of our money we give using mobile money, but in countries like the US, we're giving things like prepaid ATM cards and the like. The cost of those small transfers is higher than if you just gave someone a lump sum. So you can actually say, we put all your periodic income into one lump sum, so here it is. So let's challenge the status quo, because these are ideas that people came up with and we're like, we need to study what works, what is the best way. Is it every day, is it every month, is it every quarter, is it at once? What are the methods that work? I think we really need to challenge the status quo, but I understand where you're coming from. Thank you for bringing it up.
I think this is a very impressive argument, and we can learn also for other countries for it. For example, in Germany, I'm sure that young persons who would like to run a startup would say, please give me the basic income lump sum, yeah, for example, for 1 year, 3 persons, say round about 60,000 euro, then they can invest a lot in a new startup. When they, for example, quickly fail, then we would have to announce, sorry, wait a year, you are poor, you have to survive, and next year you can restart. Yeah, various other persons, and then you see the eligibility becomes a discussion, would say, I would like to be protected against this. Please give me this every month. So I am protected against doing bad things with it because I'm not interested in a startup at all. So how to solve that? That's a very interesting question. So your argument is also important for us here in Germany and so on, because here also, especially young persons want to do something new, yeah, which the old economy from my generation does not give them. Yeah? So therefore, in the African countries, you want to start with new things, and I think here in Europe also many would like to start with new things. Therefore, we have this huge discussion on startups as a new investment strategy, which could be highly based on basic income. But then the period is the real argument on it, that individuals may say, okay, we vote for basic income, but what is the rightful period? Should we open that door for political discussion? I do not know.
Very important point. And like with the UBI RCT we're doing in Kenya, we have people who are receiving monthly, so we're giving it periodically monthly for up to 12 years. There's a group that got their lump sum. Like, this is what you have got in 12 years, welcome, here it is. And so we're going to look, and then there are those who got their lump sum divided up into two years, I believe. And at the end of 12 years, we're going to look and say what happened to the 3 different groups. In the US, we also have an RCT that we started, and we're giving the same amount of money in 3 different ways. One group is getting it as a lump sum, one is getting it over a longer period of time, and one over a shorter period of time. So we need to challenge the status quo and try to find out what is the best way for this to work. Yeah.
First, thank you for your excellent presentation and your insights that you brought with you today. My name is Martin. I'm a PhD student at Ingolstadt in Bavaria. And my question is, so I missed one argument that is brought up very often, talking about basic income and especially developing countries, Southeast Asia and Africa. And this is the argument of population development. So if you look at the numbers, the argument is that basic income supports people to get them more years of education because they don't have to work that early, you fight child work, and so on and so forth. But you didn't talk about that so far. My question is why? Because this is probably the most important thing, how to reduce climate gases, CO2 basically, carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Martin. Please.
My questions are...
Sorry, what is your name?
Oh, sorry, thank you. My name is Clementine. I'm from Freebus, here in Harvard, a PhD candidate. My question is also about the definition of the UBI. You mentioned that before, on the point of individual payments. And I think you said that a lot of the transfers, the unconditional cash transfers are to households. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, because one of the main things about the individual payments is that they're empowering for individuals, and especially from a gender perspective, they can have an impact on the power dynamics within relationships. So, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you.
My name is Robert Ulmer from Berlin, Netzwerk Grundeinkommen. I just want a little hear a little more about the character of cash transfer as a kind of reward for not destroying nature. Is it just a statistic fact, or is it a kind of order which you tell the people, you get the money now, please don't make your food with the wood?
That's a very straightforward question.
Martin, PhD student, thank you very much. That is a very important point. I should have talked about that. So, in Mexico has had the longest cash transfer program, I believe, Progressa, right? And one of the things that Progressa has found is that when people receive cash transfers, they're more likely to use family planning services, and also the number of children they have reduces. In Rwanda also recently we found that, especially for women, their fertility aspirations go down. They want less children, or they want no children at all. And that is a very direct impact on the environment. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Full disclosure, I made this presentation in the middle of submitting a huge grant for climate disasters. He was shocked. I sent it to him at 3 a.m. last night. So I was working many long nights working on submitting a grant proposal for climate response. But very important point, cash so far has been found to reduce fertility, especially in Southeast Asia and in Africa. But you know what is interesting? With the little evidence that there is, cash transfers in European countries and in the US increases the number of children that are born. Very interesting, right? It's a lot of anecdotal information. No real RCTs have been done, and we're actually applying for a grant to study the impact of cash transfers on fertility in the more the income-rich countries. But thank you for bringing up that point. Clementine asked about a definition of UBI, individual versus household. In the UBI study that we're doing in Kenya, we're actually giving it at individual level. So every adult in the household, and once they grow up and get to adulthood, we also begin giving them money. So it is at individual level. For our other projects, most of our other projects, we do it at household level. But right now, one of the things that my team is doing is we're working out, remember that last graph I showed you where like if we do it so well in the country, maybe other people will want to come on board. We're saying, can we, because we give nominal amounts right now. If it's $1,000, we'll give $1,000 in Kenya, in the US, in wherever it is. But we're saying we need to be cognizant that the purchasing power parity comes in as well. So my team at the moment, we're working on how much would it cost if we do a PPP adjusted cash transfer at individual level. How much would it take to give everyone in a particular country a UBI? So we are, once again, it's a very, we are learning how to do this because we found out that if we go to a president and tell him, you give all your people $2.15, including the children who are below poverty line, this is how much it's going to cost. We may give people heart attacks. So we are working it out. In your country, this is what it would mean, what $2.15 would mean per person in that country. Once again, a lot of learning that is going on for very new concepts. But what a very interesting question. What about giving people a reward for protecting the environment? And this, the PES study that I talked about, that was one of the things it was looking at. People would get cash if they did not destroy, if they did not cut their own forest. Very interesting. One of the things that we had to make sure was that they're not going to cut trees in the neighbor's forest, right? So there's so much to learn. Yeah, so you get money because your trees are intact, but you were found hauling trees from the next door. So very interesting concept. But I really think we just have to put these wild ideas down on paper as some forms of concepts. Initially, they will be rejected when we apply, but when more and more people are submitting these wild ideas, the funders will say, maybe there's something we are missing, right? And probably will be able to get funding to do some of these crazy things and build on the evidence base around cash and the environment. I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you, Miriam.